We're a coolant supplier and have trouble getting our customers to try our coolants. And once they try it, they're reluctant to change. What can we do to convince them? Typically, when a coolant supplier has a new coolant they want a customer to try, they nag them for a few weeks, nag them for a few weeks, nag them for a few weeks, and finally the company says, all right, we'll try your coolant. They put the coolant in a separate tank, they run a few parts, they look at the parts, and the coolant supplier says, well, what do you think? And the operator says, well, part looks okay, didn't get any burning, nothing bad happened. Yeah, coolant seems okay. And the coolant manufacturer says, well, do you want to switch to our coolant? I said, nah, you know, we like what we have. We'll just stick with that. And really the key is to measure something. You've got to measure something to see, okay, is it really better? So let's focus on spindle power. You can measure spindle power by hooking up the grindometer and measuring the power, or you can measure it with the load meter on the machine. As long as you keep everything else constant, the load meter is proportional to power. Now, when you grind, and if you measure the spindle power, 98% of the power required to drive that spindle, after you separate idling power and maybe the power to accelerate the coolant, but 98% of the power in grinding goes into heat. If we have less power, we have less heat. If we have less power when we're switching coolants, well, we've really got a better coolant, at least in terms of grinding power. We get better lubricity, and less power in grinding is good because, well, that means we can crank up our feed rates as long as we keep some other things in check without anything bad happening. So if we have lower power with the new coolant, we can increase our feed rates and still now get the same amount of power as we had originally and without a bigger risk of burn or cracking or other things happening. So here's a company who's a customer of mine, and they measured spindle power with the grindometer, and they did it 3 different times. So we said, okay, in test number 1, we've got the original coolant in red, and we've got the trial coolant in blue. This was grinding of tungsten carbide end mills, fluke grinding. So as we can see, part 1, part 2, part 3, up to part 20, the coolant number 2 is generating significantly less power than coolant number 1. It means it's lubricating better at the wheel workpiece interface, giving us less rubbing against when those diamonds rub against that carbide, and especially against that cobalt. Less friction, less heat. So that was for test number 1. What we also saw is the power stayed steadier. So it looks like either the coolant's doing a better job of keeping the diamond sharp, or more likely keeping the wheel from loading as quickly. Either way though, at least in terms of power, coolant number 2 is a better coolant. But let's do it again under different conditions and see if we get the same result. So we repeated the test. This time we did a different part, different size, stuck the wheel every 5 parts, and what we see in red is the original coolant, coolant number 1. What we see in blue is coolant number 2. Well, once again, we're getting not quite half, but close to half the power. Half the power means half the heat generation. So really, we can crank up feed rates some more without anything bad happening because we're getting less heat. That was test number 2. So things are looking pretty good for coolant number 2. But let's just make sure. So we did it again, test number 3. This time we did it in a bigger end mill. Again, we stuck the wheel every 5 parts. Now here the differences weren't quite as drastic, but again, coolant number 2 is producing less heat than coolant number 1. Now we should also measure wheel wear just to make sure, but in terms of power, we've got 3 separate tests on 3 separate parts, all of them showing the same thing. Coolant number 2 is doing better than coolant number 1 in terms of power. So coolant number 2 definitely deserves some investigation into whether we should switch to this. Let's also measure other stuff. Let's look at wheel wear, Let's look at all the other issues associated with coolant, foaming, bacteria growth, etc., etc. But in terms of grinding performance, coolant number 2 is looking pretty good right now. If you've got a chart like this and you're a coolant supplier, make sure you show it to the production manager, because it's stuff like this that's hard to argue with. This really says, okay, coolant number 2 is looking a lot better than coolant number 1. Show it to him. He's much more likely to switch if you give him some hard evidence as to why your coolant is better.